None shall leave this place unless you subscribe.
We are talking Saint Catherine from 2024. And this is a religious, demonic, possession-themed anthology movie. Multiple directors and everything like that. The anthology is actually an interesting way to describe this, because it is an anthology, but it's sort of incorporated into a kind of singular theme or even story to a certain degree. So we do have a main story. I guess you would say the wraparound story, but there are, it's significant. There's a significant kind of portion of the runtime of this one is dedicated, I would say, to our main plot line, where a young girl is taken to a convent by I think it's a police officer. And this convent has a little bit of a reputation for being a little bit off book and dealing with things that are kind of like have dealt with the occult or the demonic, and the mother superior has been excommunicated, but they are still a functioning convent. So this young girl who's had a troubled past, you might say, is taken in by this kind of nunnery, and there she's introduced to a conjuring sort of style evidence room where this convent and the nuns in it have collected a variety of occult items, artifacts that have been sort of locked away and try to keep away from the public at large. And this new girl is kind of tasked to sort of go in there really, and ultimately when she comes close to one of these objects, we get a kind of little side quest story. So yes, this is an anthology, but it almost feels like when you play a video game and you have the main quest, and then you kind of stray off to kind of a few little side stories here and there, because they're all sort of in the same vein in regards to style, theme, and even sort of production quality, I would say. So let's talk about a little bit more detail, shall we? What works in this movie's favour? Now, this being a relatively low budget movie, I've got to say I was quite impressed with the production value here, to be honest. Certainly we have our main story taking place in this very kind of old building, and convent, and it looks great. I mean, it looks, legitimately like a kind of like a place of worship, scary, sort of dark, good setting for a horror movie, and just there's a general sort of good production value within this movie, even among all these segments. And there's not like loads, but each one of them I still feel has a consistent high production value. I mean, we're not talking mega budget or anything like that, but they've made the most of what they got, and the filmmaking prowess by the variety of filmmakers here seems confident. Nothing really seems like super cheap. So it gives it somewhat of a consistent feel to it, and it's all dealing with demonic possession or demons in some respect. So, which brings me on to kind of the VFX, and I've got to say we get some pretty impressive demonic effects in this movie, from sort of horns, creatures to sort of like fleshy wounds and things like that. Again, all pretty good quality. So I was quite impressed with this, just the visual panache, if you like, about this movie, where I felt like, oh wow, this feels like it's got time and effort put towards it. It's surprising I really haven't heard of this movie before. I think the acting is, for the most part, pretty strong. The only actor I really recognised here was Maria Olsen, who pops up in a variety of horror films. She's actually in one of the segments. And then there is a little bit of possibly dubbed, I want to say, for one of the sections. But I never thought there was any particularly bad acting. I mean, it's sort of okay to pretty good at the very least. But again, the acting wise, it was sort of fairly sort of consistent. And because these stories are all to do with kind of possession of some kind, it almost does feel like it's somewhat of a natural progression from the main storyline to a degree, even though it's completely separate characters and even separate faiths. For example, we have one of the kind of the story segments is about, you know, Islam, and we have like a story to do with that. So, you know, there's some elements here that have, you know, a difference in respect. And the that was probably one of the more interesting little side stories, I would say, because again, it's something you don't see that much of. That there was an Islamic exorcist movie, I believe, but again, it has a little bit, you know, somewhat something new to add to the conversation, I suppose, and that's to do with this kind of guy who's like a bit of a charlatan in regards to an exorcism. So that was quite good. There's a pretty gross one where we have this woman which is pregnant, and this priest believes she's carrying the kind of like a demonic baby, and it goes pretty hard. And I was like, oh, this is like pretty strong in regards to some of the violence on here. And I was almost a little surprised it went as far as it did. Certainly when in regards to newborn babies, let me just kind of say that. So, you know, it's a well-produced movie. I think it has an interesting theme. The story, the main sort of story is, as I say, gives probably the bulk of the runtime here, and as such feels more of like a complete story with just a few like sort of, I say, side quests. Acting solid, production value solid, VFX solid. So there's a lot to enjoy in this movie, I would say. So why do I sound hesitant? Why am I saying, oh, I'm surprised I haven't heard about it? I do think there's problems. I think the framing device here almost in some respects doesn't come across like an anthology, because these little stories are interwoven into the kind of the story main as a narrative little you know, point where we're having these little artifacts giving this like girl visions and stuff. It almost feels like it's meant to be part of the story, but as such, it ends up being a little bit sort of disjointed in regards to its narrative flow, because it almost feels like you're watching like one story, then all of a sudden it kind of just veers off into a completely different story, then comes back for a little while, then veers off to another one. So it's almost it almost feels like it's a sort of a cross between a film with a continuous narrative and an anthology, and sort of straddles the line between the two. And as such, I think it sort of is interesting because of that, but at the same time, I think it's to its detriment, because it's a little jarring, because you feel like you're almost watching a continuous narrative, and then it just kind of flips without any sort of you know, sort of like, here's the next story, without kind of like it stopping and starting. It just kind of cuts into the kind of like the next story. The other thing I would say that goes along with that, a lot of these sort of little sort of the smaller stories within the main one kind of feel like part of a story. And this is my main criticism of this movie, is that we have all of the stories in this film are based on possession of some kind, or exorcism of some kind. So they're all quite similar, but a lot of them feel like you're coming in part way through the story, and you feel like that there was stuff you should have been seeing before this or after. So the films seem like, in a way, not all of them, but a lot of them feel like they're somewhat incomplete, and you feel like I needed a little bit more context to this, or you don't really feel like you've got to know the characters that well, because it's just kind of getting on to the point. Even in our main story, I didn't really think we got to know our sort of young girl, this main character, particularly well. So the point being, I think, what I'm trying to say here is, I think the aesthetics of this movie are very good, but the storytelling in it lacks, because the the narratives are all fairly similar, and as such they seem like they are part of the same story, but they're really not. And then the narratives, the individual narratives that we do get, don't seem fully realised. So storytelling wise, I think this movie is lacking, which is a shame, because as I say, I do think the presentation of this movie is actually pretty strong. And in a way, the film also has a problem where the stories are so similar to a degree. You know, a little bit of window dressing aside, it's kind of like, it's almost like telling the same story, or a variation of it again and again. It's like, oh, it's some innocent person getting possessed, or someone coming into a situation where there is someone possessed and kind of being surprised, and oh my god, there's demons and stuff. And it's kind of the same broad kind of strokes in regards to the kind of the storytelling narrative. So I think there should have been more care personally to try and make the stories either, you know, definitely kind of seem a lot more kind of separate than they kind of are, and then maybe have a little bit of variety, or just have a singular narrative with other, you can have maybe other sort of demons or something introduced, but it's this kind of halfway house feeling that this movie has, where I never really feel it sort of settled on a kind of particular style. So that being said though, I do think the presentation here is worth watching, despite some of my critiques I kind of, you know, highlighted here, I would suggest. So I think overall, the movie's, if you like possession films, it's probably worth a watch, again. But don't be expecting, I think, it to be particularly memorable. It never really feels like it has a real stake on an interesting story. So I am going to give it a 6 out of 10, because I just think the presentation of the movie is fairly decent, and you know, there's some good stuff here, but it's just not made the most of. So 6 out of 10 for me. What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.